They said he was broken beyond repair, a creature fit only for the knacker's yard and the rendering of his bones into glue. But I saw in his dark eyes the same wound I carried in my own heart, the wound of being discarded by those who should have seen our worth, and I knew in that moment that our fates were bound together by threads invisible but unbreakable. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and I was born in the smallest room of Ashford Hall, in a narrow bed tucked beneath the eaves where the servants slept, and the winter wind found every crack in the ancient walls. My mother was a seamstress, her fingers perpetually pricked and calloused from mending the fine silks and velvets of the aristocracy, her eyes strained from years of squinting at delicate stitches by candlelight. My father was the head groom, a man whose voice could calm the wildest stallion, whose hands knew the language of horses better than most men know the language of their own hearts, whose presence in the stables brought order and peace to creatures that sensed his genuine love for them. He died when I was 17, thrown from a spooked mare during a thunderstorm that split the sky with lightning and shook the very foundations of the hall, and my mother followed him to the grave 2 winters later, her lungs weakened by years of breathing the dust of fabric and the cold drafts of the servants' quarters. Her heart, I believe, simply too broken to continue without him. I remained at Ashford Hall because I had nowhere else to go, and because leaving would have meant abandoning the only home I had ever known, the only world that made sense to me despite its rigid hierarchies and unspoken cruelties. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, took pity on me and trained me as a housemaid, seeing something in me, perhaps, that reminded her of her own younger self. I learned to move through the great house like a ghost, invisible and silent, noticed only when I failed to perform my duties to perfection. I learned to dust the porcelain vases without rattling them, to polish the silver until it gleamed like captured moonlight, to light the fires before dawn so that when the master descended for breakfast, the rooms would already be warm and welcoming as if heated by magic rather than by the labor of servants who had risen in the darkness. I learned to be invisible, which is the first and most important lesson any servant must master if she hopes to survive in the employ of the great houses. The Duke of Ashford, Lord Sebastian Hale, was not a man who noticed servants, and for this I was initially grateful. He was 32 years old when my story truly begins, tall and dark-haired, with eyes the color of a winter sky just before snow falls, gray and cold and seemingly bottomless. His face might have been handsome if it ever softened, if the lines around his mouth ever curved upward rather than down, if some spark of warmth ever penetrated the ice that seemed to encase him. But in all my years at the hall, I never once saw him smile, never once heard him laugh, never once witnessed any emotion break through the marble perfection of his aristocratic composure. He had married young, an arranged union with Lady Charlotte Pembroke, a woman of impeccable breeding and considerable fortune, whose portrait still hung in the long gallery, depicting a gentle face with kind eyes and a smile that seemed to hold secrets. She had died 3 years into the marriage, carried off by a fever that swept through the county one autumn, taking her and a dozen villagers in its merciless progression. There were no heirs, no children to carry on the Hale name, no proof that the union had ever been more than a business arrangement between powerful families. The nursery on the 3rd floor remained locked, its door gathering dust, a monument to hopes that had never been fulfilled, to a future that had been snatched away before it could begin. After Lady Charlotte's death, the Duke retreated into himself, building walls so high and so thick that no one could scale them. He ran his estates with cold efficiency, expanding his holdings, increasing his wealth, treating everything and everyone as assets to be managed or liabilities to be eliminated. The servants whispered that his heart had frozen the night his wife died, that whatever capacity for love he had once possessed had been buried in the churchyard alongside her delicate body. I had no reason to doubt them, no evidence to contradict the consensus that Lord Sebastian Hale was a man incapable of human warmth. In 7 years of service, he had never once looked directly at me, never acknowledged my existence beyond the occasional curt nod when I entered a room to tend the fire while he sat reading by the window, lost in whatever thoughts occupied a mind as vast and cold as his estate's. But I knew him better than he realized. Servants always do. We see the masters when they believe themselves unobserved, when they drop the masks they wear for society and reveal the fragile humanity beneath. We witness their private griefs, their secret weaknesses, the cracks in their carefully constructed facades. I knew that the Duke slept poorly, because I was often the one sent to rekindle his study fire at 3 a.m. when the other maids refused to venture into his domain, frightened by his reputation and the darkness that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. I would slip into the room as quietly as a shadow, add logs to the dying embers, and glance at him sitting in his chair by the window, staring out at nothing, his face haggard with exhaustion and something that looked very much like grief. I knew that he kept a small portrait of Lady Charlotte in his desk drawer, because I had seen him holding it once, his face twisted with an emotion I could not name, his fingers trembling as they traced the painted lines of her face. He had not known I was there, had not heard me enter, and when he finally sensed my presence and looked up, his eyes had been red-rimmed and glistening. He had said nothing, simply turned away, and I had fled the room with my heart pounding, feeling as though I had witnessed something sacred and forbidden, a private moment of vulnerability that he would surely resent me for observing. I knew that despite his reputation for coldness, he was not cruel in the way that some masters were cruel. He paid his servants fairly, allowed them holidays and time to visit their families, and had never raised his hand or his voice to any member of the household staff. The punishments he administered were just, proportionate to the offenses committed, and he had been known to show leniency in cases where other lords would have turned servants out without references. He was not beloved, but he was respected, which is perhaps all any master can hope for when warmth has been burned out of him by tragedy. I also knew about his horses, and this is where my story truly begins. The stables at Ashford Hall were legendary throughout England, spoken of in the same reverent tones as the great racing establishments of Newmarket and Epsom. The Duke bred thoroughbreds, magnificent creatures destined for the racetracks, their bloodlines carefully cultivated over generations to produce speed and stamina, and that ineffable quality that separates champions from merely good horses. He employed a small army of grooms and trainers, spared no expense on feed and veterinary care, and oversaw every aspect of the breeding program with a personal attention that surprised those who knew only his cold public persona. It was his one passion, the only pursuit that seemed to penetrate the ice around his heart. He would spend hours in the stables, conferring with his trainers, watching the horses exercise on the private track that wound through the eastern meadows like a ribbon laid across green velvet. His racing colors, crimson and silver, were known to every betting man in the country, feared by competitors, and celebrated by the sporting press. When an Ashford horse entered a race, the odds shifted, the crowd held its breath, and more often than not, the crimson and silver silks crossed the finish line first. Among all his horses, there was one that stood apart, a stallion that seemed to embody everything the Duke had worked to create. Obsidian, they called him, a name that perfectly captured his appearance, a horse as black as a moonless night, as black as coal from the deepest mines, as black as the despair that sometimes overtook me in my darkest moments. His coat gleamed like polished jet when the light caught it, and between his eyes was a single white star that seemed to glow against the darkness of his face, a beacon of light in all that shadow. He was the finest horse the Duke had ever bred, the culmination of years of careful selection and planning, the answer to prayers that Sebastian Hale would never admit to having uttered. At 2 years old, Obsidian had won 3 races in a row, each victory more decisive than the last, each performance more stunning than the previous. He ran as though the wind itself was his ally, as though gravity had loosened its grip on his powerful form, as though he was not merely racing against other horses, but against the very limitations of mortal flesh. The sporting papers called him unbeatable, a once-in-a-generation talent, a horse destined for immortality. Bookmakers refused to take bets against him at reasonable odds, knowing that wagering against Obsidian was tantamount to burning one's money. There was talk of entering him in the Royal Cup, the most prestigious race in England, with its prize of £1,000,000 and its guarantee of immortality in the annals of British racing. I had watched Obsidian from afar since his birth, sneaking down to the stables in my rare moments of free time, standing at the fence while the grooms exercised the horses and the morning mist rose from the meadows like breath from the earth. My father had taught me to love horses before he taught me anything else, before I could read or write or understand the cruel mathematics of social class that would define my life. Some of my earliest memories were of sitting on his shoulders while he walked through the paddocks at dawn, his voice low and gentle as he explained the qualities of each animal, the stories behind their names, the dreams he had for their futures. He had believed that horses possessed souls, that they understood more than we gave them credit for, that they could sense kindness and cruelty with an accuracy that put human judgment to shame. I had inherited his gift, or perhaps his madness. Horses calmed in my presence, sought me out, pressed their velvet noses against my palm, nickered softly when I approached as though greeting an old friend. It was my secret, this connection, one I guarded carefully because I knew how it would look if anyone discovered that a housemaid spent her precious free hours communing with creatures worth more than she would earn in 100 lifetimes of service. Obsidian was special even among special horses, different in ways I could not articulate but felt in my very bones. The first time I saw him, a gangly foal with legs too long for his body and eyes too wise for his age, I felt something shift in my chest, a recognition that transcended reason. He had looked at me across the paddock fence, his dark eyes curious and unafraid, and I had known with a certainty I could not explain that our fates were somehow intertwined, that the thread connecting us had been spun long before either of us was born. It was fanciful thinking, the kind of romantic nonsense that servants were discouraged from indulging, but I could not shake it no matter how firmly I reminded myself of my station and my place. I watched him grow from foal to yearling to magnificent stallion, following his career with the devotion of a secret admirer, treasuring each glimpse of him like a miser hoards gold. When he won his races, I celebrated silently in my attic room, pressing my hand over my heart as though I could feel his triumphant heartbeat echoing through me. When the newspapers praised him, calling him the hope of English racing, the greatest horse of his generation, I cut out the articles and kept them hidden beneath my mattress, a shrine to a creature I had no right to love, but loved nonetheless. It was foolish, I knew. He was not mine, and never would be. The distance between a servant and a duke's prize stallion was as vast as the distance between the servant's quarters and the stars. But the heart does not obey the dictates of reason, and mine had claimed him long before my mind could object. The accident happened on a gray morning in late autumn, when the mist lay thick over the meadows and the trees had begun to shed their golden leaves like tears. There was a chill in the air that seemed to presage something terrible, though perhaps I am only remembering it that way because of what came after. I was carrying a bucket of coal across the courtyard, my breath forming small clouds in the cold, my mind occupied with the endless catalogue of tasks that awaited me, when I heard the commotion from the direction of the training track. The sounds reached me first, the shouts of men, sharp and panicked, rising above the usual quiet murmur of the stables, and then a terrible high scream, a sound that could only have come from a horse in agony, a sound that cut through the morning air like a blade and embedded itself in my heart. I dropped the bucket without thinking, coal scattering across the cobblestones, and ran toward the stables, my skirts hiked up in my hands, my heart pounding against my ribs with such force that I thought it might break through. A crowd had gathered at the edge of the training track, grooms and stable boys and the head trainer, all standing in a loose semicircle with their faces pale and their eyes fixed on something I could not yet see. I pushed through them, ignoring their surprised glances, their muttered questions about what a housemaid was doing at the stables, until I broke through the ring of bodies and could finally see what had happened. Obsidian lay on the ground, his great body heaving, his legs thrashing against the dirt as though trying to run even while prone. Blood stained the ground beneath him, bright crimson against the brown earth, and his eyes rolled with pain and fear, showing the whites in a way that made him look almost human in his suffering. 2 men were trying to hold his head, keeping him from injuring himself further with his struggles, while a third examined his foreleg, which was bent at an angle that made my stomach lurch and my vision swim. The Duke stood apart from the chaos, separated from the crowd by an invisible barrier that even in this moment of crisis no one dared to cross. His face was as pale as marble, drained of all color, and his hands were clenched at his sides so tightly that I could see the tendons standing out against his skin. He was utterly still, a statue carved from ice and despair, his gray eyes fixed on the suffering horse with an intensity that revealed everything his frozen expression tried to hide. I had never seen him look so shaken, so vulnerable, so profoundly human. For a moment, the mask slipped entirely, and I glimpsed the man beneath, a man capable of feeling, of caring, of being wounded by something as simple as the suffering of an animal he loved. The veterinarian arrived within the hour, summoned by a messenger who had ridden at breakneck speed to the village and back. He was a portly man with spectacles and a grave expression, Dr. Harrington, whose reputation for skill was matched only by his reputation for honesty, even when that honesty brought news no one wanted to hear. I watched from the stable door, having found a position where I could observe without being noticed, as he examined Obsidian with hands that were gentle but thorough. The horse had been sedated by then, his dark eyes glazed with whatever drug they had given him to dull the pain, his mighty chest rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed too slow, too shallow. The white star on his forehead seemed dimmer somehow, as if the light within him had begun to fade, as if the essence that made him special was already starting to slip away. I could not hear what the veterinarian said to the Duke, but I could read the verdict in the slump of Sebastian's shoulders, in the way he turned away and pressed his fist against the stable wall, in the slight bow of his head that spoke of defeat accepted. Obsidian would never race again. The injury was too severe, the damage too extensive, the prognosis too grim. Some spoke in hushed voices of putting him down, of ending his suffering with a merciful bullet, of sparing him the indignity of a lingering decline. Others suggested turning him out to pasture somewhere far from the hall, letting him live out his days as a crippled reminder of former glory, invisible and forgotten. The Duke chose neither option, and his choice was the cruelest of all because it was not cruel in intention, but in effect. 3 days after the accident, when the first shock had subsided and the practical matters could no longer be avoided, he announced that Obsidian would be sold. Not at auction, where the shame would be public and the whispers would follow him to every gathering of the racing elite, but privately, quietly, for whatever price could be obtained. The horse that had been valued at £50,000, the horse that had been destined for immortality, was now worth nothing more than his weight in meat. The final indignity came when the Duke declared that anyone who wished to purchase the animal could have him for £1. It was not charity. There was no generosity in it. It was contempt. It was erasure. He wanted Obsidian gone, removed from his sight, eliminated from his life. As if by banishing the horse he could also banish the reminder of his failed investment, his shattered dreams, his inability to control the capricious cruelty of fate. I stood in the shadows of the servants' corridor when I heard the news, my hand pressed against the cold stone wall to steady myself as the world tilted around me. £1. The price of a loaf of bread at the village bakery. The price of a pint of ale at the tavern where the grooms gathered on their evenings off. The price the Duke of Ashford, one of the wealthiest men in England, placed on a creature who had given him everything, who had run until his heart nearly burst with the effort, who had carried his colors to victory after victory with a courage and determination that should have earned him something better than abandonment. £1, and Obsidian would belong to whoever claimed him first, probably a knacker who would work him until he dropped and then sell his remains for glue and dog food, his magnificent form rendered down to its component parts as though he had never been anything more than raw material waiting to be processed. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my narrow bed beneath the eaves, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl around the chimneys like a chorus of mourning spirits. The moonlight crept through the gap in my curtains, painting silver shadows on the walls, and I watched them shift and dance as the hours crawled past. My savings were meager, coins accumulated over 7 years of service, carefully hidden in a tin box beneath a loose floorboard where no one would think to look. I had been saving for something, though I was never quite sure what. Perhaps a small shop someday, a haberdasher's, or a tea room where I could be my own mistress. Perhaps passage to America, where they said a person's birth mattered less than her willingness to work. Perhaps simply the security of knowing I would not starve if I ever lost my position, if Mrs. Pemberton decided I was too old or too slow or too troublesome to keep. The total came to £1, 3 shillings and 4 pence. It was everything I had in the world, every sacrifice I had made, every small luxury I had denied myself for the sake of an uncertain future. By morning, my decision was made. I did not make it consciously. It was more as though the decision made itself, emerging fully formed from the chaos of my sleepless thoughts like a butterfly from a cocoon. I dressed in the gray darkness before dawn, my fingers trembling as I buttoned my worn dress and tied back my hair, moving quietly so as not to wake the other servants who shared the attic floor. I retrieved my tin box from its hiding place and counted the coins one final time, feeling their weight in my palm, understanding what I was about to do and accepting it, despite every rational argument against it. Then I slipped the coins into my pocket and crept down the servants' stairs, out into the cold morning air, toward the stables that loomed against the lightening sky like the fulfillment of a destiny I had not known was mine. The head groom, Mr. Hartley, was already at the stables when I arrived, his breath visible in the cold, his weathered hands busy with the morning routine. He was an older man, grizzled and weathered by decades of outdoor work, who had known my father and treated me with a gruff kindness that I treasured more than he probably realized. His eyebrows rose toward his receding hairline when he saw me approaching, surprise evident in every line of his craggy face. I told him I had come to buy the horse. I said the words plainly, without preamble or apology, as though purchasing a champion thoroughbred for pocket change was something housemaids did every day. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him wrestling with a dozen responses. Disbelief, certainly, that I would even consider such a thing. Concern for my sanity, probably, wondering if the stress of service had finally unbalanced my mind. Perhaps even a flicker of respect, though it was quickly hidden behind his professional reserve, for the audacity of a servant girl who dared to want something beyond her station. Finally, he shook his head slowly, the way one might shake one's head at a child who has announced her intention to fly to the moon, and asked if I understood what I was doing, if I knew that the horse was ruined, that he would never be sound again, that I would be throwing away my savings on a creature that could not even carry a rider, much less compete in the races that had been his purpose. I told him I understood. I told him I understood everything, and that I wanted to buy him anyway. He asked where I planned to keep the horse, since I certainly could not stable him at Ashford Hall, and the boarding fees at any reputable establishment would exceed what I earned in a year. I had thought about this during the long, sleepless hours of the night, turning the problem over and over until a solution emerged. My mother's sister, Aunt Prudence, owned a small farm 3 miles from the estate, a modest holding with a few chickens and a vegetable garden, and a ramshackle barn that had seen better days. She had offered me a home after my parents died, an offer I had refused because I could not bear to leave the only place I had ever belonged, the only connection I still had to my father's memory. But she had a pasture where a horse could graze, and an old barn where he could shelter from the weather, and I knew she would not turn me away if I came to her now, even if she thought I had lost my mind. Mr. Hartley sighed, the sound of a man who had seen too much of the world to be surprised by anything anymore, but who still found himself occasionally confronted with things that tested even his considerable experience. He told me to wait while he fetched the paperwork, his tone suggesting he thought I would come to my senses before he returned. When he came back, carrying a single sheet of paper that would change my life, I was still standing where he had left me, my determination unshaken. The bill of sale was simple, almost insultingly so for a transaction involving a creature who had once been valued at a fortune. It transferred ownership of the horse known as Obsidian from Lord Sebastian Hale, Duke of Ashford, to Miss Eleanor Whitmore, housemaid. I signed my name at the bottom, my handwriting neat and careful despite my shaking hand, forming the letters I had learned as a child with a mother who believed that even servants should know how to read and write. Then I counted out my coins onto the wooden table, the clink of copper and silver loud in the morning quiet. £1 exactly. The 3 shillings and 4 pence I kept, knowing I would need them for feed and medicine and the 100 other expenses that would arise in the days ahead. Mr. Hartley pocketed the money and gave me a long look, his eyes holding something that might have been pity, or might have been admiration, or might have been both at once. He said he hoped I knew what I was getting into, that a lame horse was not a pet, that the responsibilities I was taking on would consume whatever life I had thought to have outside my service. Then he led me to the back stable, where Obsidian stood alone in a stall that had once been fit for a champion and was now nothing more than a holding pen for damaged goods waiting to be disposed of. The horse raised his head when I entered, his nostrils flaring at my unfamiliar scent, his ears swiveling to track my movement. His coat had lost its shine, matted and dull from days of neglect. The gleaming jet of his championship days reduced to something that looked more like dirty charcoal. His injured leg was wrapped in bandages that needed changing, the white fabric stained with blood and the yellowish discharge of infection, evidence that no one had bothered to properly care for a creature they had already written off as worthless. But his eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes that had first captured my heart across a paddock fence when he was nothing but a gangly foal, found mine and held them with a gaze that seemed to see through to my very soul. I approached slowly, my hand extended, my voice soft and low, using the tone my father had taught me, the tone that told horses they were safe, that they were among friends, that whatever had happened before, this moment was a new beginning. I called him by name, letting the syllables roll off my tongue like a prayer, and told him I had come to take him home. He snorted once, a sound that might have been skepticism, or might have been acknowledgement, or might have been simply the reaction of an animal in pain to an unexpected kindness. When I reached him, he lowered his great head, his muzzle seeking my palm with a trust that nearly broke my heart, and I felt the warmth of his breath against my skin, the velvet softness of his nose, and I knew that whatever happened next, however impossible the odds, however foolish the world might think me, I had made the right choice. Getting him to Aunt Prudence's farm was an ordeal I prefer not to remember in detail, though certain moments are seared into my memory with a clarity that time has not diminished. The veterinarian had declared him unfit to walk any distance, warning that the stress of travel could worsen his injury, could turn a potentially healable wound into a permanent crippling. But I had no money for a horse cart, no connections who could provide one, and Mr. Hartley could not spare one of the stable's vehicles without the Duke's explicit permission that would require explaining why a housemaid needed transport for a horse she had purchased for £1. In the end, I led Obsidian myself, walking the 3 miles on foot with his lead rope in my hand, covering the distance in nearly 4 hours, stopping every few hundred yards to let him rest his injured leg, to check the bandages, to speak words of encouragement that I hoped he could understand, even if he could not comprehend their meaning. He was brave, that horse. He was in terrible pain. I could see it in the way he held himself, in the tension of his muscles, in the sweat that darkened his coat despite the cold morning air. Every step must have been agony, every yard a battle against an instinct to simply lie down and give up. But he did not once refuse to follow me, did not once balk or pull back on the rope or try to escape the suffering by stopping altogether. When I tugged gently on his lead, he moved. When I spoke to him, he listened, his ears turning toward my voice as though it were an anchor in a storm of pain. When we finally reached the farm and I led him into Aunt Prudence's old barn, he stood still as I removed his halter and let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound that seemed to release not just air, but fear, not just tension, but despair. We had made it. Against all odds, against all reason, we had made it. Aunt Prudence was a practical woman who had little patience for sentiment. A farmer's daughter who had married a farmer and buried him young and learned to rely on no one but herself. She looked at the horse, looked at me, and asked bluntly what I planned to do with a lame thoroughbred and no money to care for him. Her voice was not unkind, but it held no illusions, no romantic notions about the redemptive power of love or the nobility of hopeless causes. She wanted facts, plans, evidence that I had thought this through rather than simply acting on impulse. I told her I would find a way. I told her I would work harder, save more, do whatever was necessary. I told her I believed the horse could be healed, that the veterinarian had been wrong, that what Obsidian needed was not medicine alone, but patience and care, and someone who refused to give up on him. She snorted, a sound remarkably similar to the one Obsidian had made, and informed me that she was too old to take on another mouth to feed, too tired to involve herself in schemes that were almost certainly doomed to failure. But she did not send me away. She showed me where to find the old blankets in the barn, told me there was hay in the loft that needed using before the mice got to it, and warned me that if the horse caused any trouble, damaged her property, or proved too expensive to maintain, he would be my problem to solve, not hers. It was not generosity, not exactly. It was practicality tempered with family loyalty, the recognition that she could not in good conscience turn away her dead sister's only daughter, even if that daughter had clearly lost her mind. I kept my position at Ashford Hall, because I had no choice, because the handful of coins remaining in my pocket would not last a week, because everything I earned would now go toward keeping Obsidian alive. I walked the 3 miles to work before dawn and the 3 miles back after dark, my feet blistering in shoes that were not made for such distances, my body exhausted in ways I had never known were possible. My days became a blur of endless labor, of scrubbing floors and polishing silver and changing bed linens and beating carpets and all the 100 other tasks that made up a housemaid's existence. I moved through my duties like an automaton, performing each action with mechanical precision while my mind remained fixed on the creature waiting for me in Aunt Prudence's barn, counting the hours until I could return to him, measuring time not in minutes, but in moments until I could be at his side again. Every evening, I hurried home along the darkening roads, my pace quickening as I drew closer to the farm, my heart lifting as I caught the first glimpse of the barn against the twilight sky. I changed his bandages with hands that grew more skilled each day, cleaned his wound with water. I boiled over Aunt Prudence's stove, applied poultices made from recipes my father had taught me long ago, remedies passed down through generations of horsemen who had learned that nature often provided what medicine could not. I spoke to him constantly, a running stream of words that probably made no sense but seemed to comfort him nonetheless. I told him about my day, about the small dramas of the servants' hall, about the weather and the seasons, and my memories of a time when my parents were alive, and the world seemed full of possibility rather than limitation. I told him about my hopes and my fears and my dreams, confessing things to that horse that I had never told another living soul, trusting him with secrets that would have embarrassed me if anyone had overheard. The veterinarian's diagnosis had been severe, but I was not convinced it was accurate. My father had always said that doctors knew medicine, but not horses, that they treated animals like machines to be fixed rather than souls to be healed, that they saw only symptoms and not the deeper causes that lay beneath. The injury to Obsidian's leg was real. a sprain complicated by inflammation and the early stages of what threatened to become a serious infection. But as I examined him night after night, running my hands along his leg, feeling for heat and swelling, and the subtle signs that told me what was happening beneath his skin, I began to suspect that the damage was not as permanent as everyone believed. The bone was intact. I was certain of this because my father had taught me how to tell, had shown me the difference between the feel of a sound leg and a broken one. The tendons, though strained and swollen, were not torn. Again, I knew because I had learned to know, because knowledge passed from father to daughter did not disappear simply because the father was gone. What ailed Obsidian most was the infection that had set in during those first careless days, when no one bothered to properly treat a horse they had already written off as worthless. They had bandaged his wound and left him to rot, assuming the outcome was predetermined, unwilling to invest effort in a creature whose future had already been decided. I fought that infection with everything I had, with every ounce of strength and determination I possessed. I made poultices from comfrey and calendula, herbs my father had used to heal wounds that other men declared hopeless, mixing them with honey and applying them to the wound with hands that learned to be both firm and gentle. I kept the wound clean, changing the bandages twice daily even when the smell made me gag, and the sight of the inflamed flesh brought tears to my eyes. I forced Obsidian to eat when he wanted to give up. When the pain and the weakness made him turn away from his feed, hand-feeding him oats mixed with honey and the bitter herbs that would help his body fight the infection from within. I stayed with him through the long nights when fever gripped him and his body trembled with chills that shook the very walls of his stall. I held his head in my lap, stroked his face, whispered reassurances that I was not certain I believed myself. I prayed, though I was not certain anyone was listening, sending pleas upward into the darkness, begging whatever powers might exist to spare this creature who had done nothing to deserve his suffering. I refused to let him die, refused to accept that our story would end here, in a ramshackle barn, with defeat and loss, and the confirmation of everything the world believed about servants and their foolish dreams. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to improve. The fever broke after a week that felt like a year, his body finally winning its battle against the infection that had threatened to consume him. The swelling in his leg diminished, the angry red of inflammation fading to a healthier pink, and then to the normal color of healing flesh. His appetite returned, tentatively at first, as though he were testing whether life was worth the effort of eating, and then with the vigor of a horse who had remembered that food was fuel, and fuel was survival. By the end of the first month, he could bear weight on the injured leg without flinching. By the end of the second, he was walking without a limp, his stride growing more confident with each passing day. By the time the first snowdrops pushed through the frozen ground and the days began to lengthen toward spring, Obsidian was moving with a freedom and grace that took my breath away, that vindicated every sacrifice I had made, that proved what I had known from the moment I first saw him in that neglected stall. He was not broken. He had never been broken. He had simply been waiting for someone to believe in him. I will never forget the first time I saw him run, truly run, not the tentative steps of convalescence, but the full glorious explosion of speed that he had been born for. It was a morning in early March, when the mist still clung to the meadows, but the sun was beginning to burn through, promising warmth and renewal and all the possibilities of spring. I had let him out into Aunt Prudence's small pasture to stretch his legs, expecting nothing more than a gentle walk around the perimeter, perhaps a brief trot to test his recovering muscles. Instead, he stood still for a moment, his head raised high, his nostrils testing the air for scents I could not detect. His ears pricked forward as though listening to a call only he could hear. Then he exploded into motion, and the world stopped. His powerful legs drove him forward, hooves pounding against the soft earth, his black coat gleaming in the pale morning light like something out of myth or legend. He raced across the pasture as if demons were chasing him, as if he had been caged for 1,000 years and had finally found the door to his prison standing open. The mist parted before him, swirling in his wake, and for a moment he seemed less like a horse than like a force of nature, unstoppable and eternal and utterly magnificent. He was not limping. He was not favoring his leg. He was not showing any sign of the injury that had been his death sentence in the eyes of every expert who had examined him. He was running with the pure, joyful abandon of a creature born for speed, running as though running were not just movement, but expression, not just locomotion, but celebration, not just survival, but art. And I stood at the fence with tears streaming down my face, my hands gripping the rough wood until splinters dug into my palms, watching the impossible made manifest before my eyes, understanding at last that miracles were real if only you were stubborn enough to believe in them. Word spread, as word always does in the countryside where secrets are currency and gossip is entertainment. The servants at Ashford Hall heard rumors of a mysterious horse being trained on a farm outside the estate, a black stallion of unusual speed and beauty, whose origins no one could quite identify. They whispered about it in the kitchens and the laundry rooms, speculating about who owned the animal and where it had come from, wondering if perhaps it was a stolen horse, a smuggled horse, a creature whose presence so close to the Duke's estates was some kind of challenge or insult. I said nothing, kept my head down, went about my duties as if I had no life beyond the polishing of candlesticks and the making of beds. When my fellow servants asked if I had heard the rumors, I shrugged and claimed ignorance. When Mrs. Pemberton commented that I seemed tired lately, I blamed the cold weather and the long nights. I guarded my secret with the fierceness of a mother protecting her child, knowing that discovery could mean the end of everything. That if the Duke learned what had become of the horse he had sold for £1, he might find some way to reclaim him, to punish me for my presumption, to destroy the dream I had nurtured into reality. But I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth emerged. Secrets have a way of escaping their cages, and mine was growing too large to contain. It was Mr. Hartley who made the connection, who followed the thread of rumor back to its source and discovered what I had done. He came to Aunt Prudence's farm one Sunday afternoon in late spring, his weathered face creased with curiosity, his eyes holding a sharpness that belied his casual manner. He had heard the stories, he said, leaning against the paddock fence with the ease of a man comfortable around horses. A black horse, fast as lightning, being ridden by a young woman across the fields. He had wondered if perhaps it might be the same horse he had sold to a housemaid some months ago. The horse everyone had declared would never walk again, much less run, much less become the subject of admiring gossip throughout the county. I led him to the pasture without speaking, my heart pounding in my chest, uncertain whether to be afraid or defiant. Obsidian was grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun, his coat gleaming with the health I had fought so hard to restore, his stance easy and confident. No trace of the broken creature he had been when I had led him from the Ashford stables. Mr. Hartley stared for a long time, his expression shifting through a sequence of emotions I could not quite read. Disbelief came first, the automatic response of a mind confronted with something that contradicted everything it knew to be true. Then wonder, as he began to accept what his eyes were telling him. And finally, something that looked almost like awe, a reverence for the inexplicable, a recognition that he was witnessing something that transcended ordinary experience. He walked slowly toward the horse, his hand extended in the greeting of one horseman to another, and Obsidian raised his head and regarded him with calm recognition. They stood together for several minutes, the old groom and the horse he had once helped train, reunited under circumstances neither could have predicted, connected by a history that I had intervened in, but not created. When Mr. Hartley finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion, stripped of its usual professional detachment. He asked how I had done it, how I had healed what the veterinarians declared unhealable, how I had brought back from the edge of destruction a creature the entire racing establishment had written off as finished. He asked as though the answer genuinely mattered to him. as though understanding my methods might change something fundamental about the way he saw the world. I told him I had simply refused to give up. I had loved Obsidian back to life, hour by hour, day by day, poultice by poultice and gentle word by gentle word, until his body remembered what it was capable of, until his spirit remembered that life was worth living. There was no secret technique, no miracle cure, no hidden knowledge that separated my approach from what others might have done. There was only patience and persistence, and a belief that transcended evidence, and a love that refused to accept the judgments of those who had never bothered to look closely enough to see what was really there. Mr. Hartley nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense, as if love were a medical treatment as valid as any drug or surgery, as if the conversation we were having was not extraordinary, but simply the natural outcome of events he should have foreseen. He asked if I intended to race him. The question caught me off guard, though perhaps it should not have. Obsidian was a racehorse, bred for the track, trained for competition, designed in every fiber of his being to run faster than other horses and cross finish lines first. It was what he had been created for, what he had excelled at before his injury, what every instinct in his magnificent body still drove him toward. To keep him hidden away on a small farm, running only in empty pastures for the joy of it, seemed almost a betrayal of his nature, a denial of the purpose that defined him. But racing required money I did not have, connections I could not claim, a social standing that was forever beyond my reach. I was a servant, a woman without family or fortune, someone the racing world would not even acknowledge as fully human, much less as a legitimate competitor. The very idea of entering Obsidian in a race was absurd, laughable, the kind of fantasy that sensible people dismissed as soon as it occurred to them. Mr. Hartley saw my hesitation and understood its cause. He told me about the Royal Cup, the grandest race in all of England, the event that every breeder and owner dreamed of winning. The entry fee was substantial, he admitted, more than I could possibly afford. The competition was fierce, the finest horses from the finest stables, each one representing generations of careful breeding and unlimited resources. But the prize was £1,000,000, a fortune that could change a life, that could transform a servant into a woman of independent means, that could open doors that had always been locked against people like me. And most importantly, he continued, the Royal Cup did not officially discriminate based on the status of the owner. The rules, written in an age when such distinctions seemed natural and immutable, specified only that the entrant must own the horse and pay the fee. Dukes and dustmen could compete on equal footing, at least in theory, their horses judged solely on merit. The great equalizer of the track rendering irrelevant all the hierarchies that governed every other aspect of English life. I told him it was impossible. I had no silks to identify my horse, no jockey to ride him, no trainer to prepare him for competition, no stable to support us. I had nothing but a horse and a stubborn refusal to accept the limitations the world tried to impose on me. And while that might be enough to keep Obsidian alive and running, it was surely not enough to challenge the greatest racing establishment in England. Mr. Hartley smiled, and the expression transformed his craggy face, softened the weathered lines, revealed a warmth I had never suspected lay beneath his professional reserve. He said he might be able to help with some of those problems. He was old, he admitted, too old to train a champion himself, too set in his ways to adapt to new methods. But he knew people throughout the racing world, connections accumulated over decades of service, favors owed and alliances forged. And he had been watching Obsidian since the horse was born, had always believed he was destined for greatness, had mourned when the accident seemed to end that destiny before it could be fulfilled. If I was willing to work harder than I had ever worked in my life, if I was willing to face ridicule and opposition and the scorn of everyone who believed a servant had no business competing against her betters, if I was willing to risk everything on a dream that logic said could never come true, then he would do everything in his power to help me succeed. I said yes. What else could I say? The universe had conspired to bring me to this moment, had placed obsidian in my path, had given me the skills to heal him and the stubbornness to try. To refuse now would be to betray not just the horse but myself, the girl who had once sat on her father's shoulders and dreamed of impossible things. The woman who had learned that impossible was just a word people used when they lacked the courage to attempt what they desired. The months that followed were the most grueling of my life, a test of endurance that pushed me to limits I had not known I possessed. I continued working at Ashford Hall, unable to give up my position when every penny was needed for Obsidian's training and care. The walk to and from the estate consumed hours of each day, time stolen from sleep I desperately needed, adding exhaustion to exhaustion until I moved through my duties in a fog of weariness that never quite lifted. Mr. Hartley came to the farm every evening after his own work at the Duke's stables was complete, bringing with him decades of knowledge and a network of connections that proved invaluable. He found me a jockey, a young man named Thomas Gray, who had fallen out of favor with the racing establishment after refusing to throw a race for a wealthy patron, choosing integrity over advancement, principle over profit. Thomas was small and light and fearless, with hands that seemed to communicate directly with the horses he rode, and he took to Obsidian immediately, recognizing in the black stallion a kindred spirit, another creature who had been cast aside by those who should have valued him. They trained together every morning, Thomas riding while I watched from the fence, calling out adjustments, noting Obsidian's responses, learning to read their partnership as it developed and deepened. The horse ran as though he had been waiting his entire life for this chance, as though the accident and the abandonment and the long months of recovery had been merely preparation for the glory that awaited. He learned Thomas's signals, anticipated his commands, synchronized his movements with the jockeys until they moved as a single entity, horse and rider merged into something greater than either could be alone. Word of our preparations reached the Duke eventually. It was inevitable, given the racing world's appetite for gossip and the unusual nature of our endeavor. Mr. Hartley reported these developments to me with a mixture of amusement and concern, recounting how Lord Sebastian had been asking questions, demanding to know who owned the black horse that was suddenly appearing at training grounds around the county, pursuing the mystery with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to its importance. The confrontation came on a Thursday afternoon in late May, when the roses were blooming in Ashford Hall's famous gardens and the air was thick with their perfume. I was changing the linens in the blue guest room, my mind occupied with questions about Obsidian's conditioning, when the door opened without warning and the Duke walked in. His presence filled the space like a sudden storm, changing the atmosphere, charging the air with electricity. I had seen him hundreds of times over the years, always at a distance, always in the context of my service, always separated by the invisible barriers that divided masters from servants. Standing alone with him in a room, the door closed behind us, no escape possible, was something entirely different. He was taller than I remembered, his shoulders broader, his presence more commanding, his gray eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat, that made me acutely aware of my worn dress and calloused hands and the sweat that still dampened my brow from the morning's labor. He knew, he said. He knew about the horse. He knew I had bought Obsidian for £1, had healed him against all expectations, was training him to race in competitions that should have been forever beyond my reach. He knew about Mr. Hartley's involvement, about Thomas Gray, about my plans to enter the Royal Cup. He had known for weeks, had been watching from a distance, had sent men to observe my training sessions and report back to him. He knew everything. I stood very still, my hands clasped in front of me, my heart hammering against my ribs with such force that I was certain he must be able to hear it. I expected anger, the cold fury of an aristocrat whose property had been transformed without his permission, whose failure had been turned into someone else's triumph. I expected him to dismiss me from service, to find some legal pretext to take back the horse, to crush my dreams with a single aristocratic decree. Instead, he crossed to the window and stood looking out at the gardens below. He crossed to the window and stood looking out at the gardens below, his back to me, his tall form silhouetted against the afternoon light. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, stripped of its usual formality, carrying an undertone I had never heard before. He asked why. The question surprised me. Not what I was doing or how I had done it, but why. What possessed a servant girl to spend her life savings on a broken horse? What madness drove her to challenge the natural order of things, to compete against lords and earls and men who had been born to privilege she could never claim? What did I hope to accomplish, and what did I believe would happen when I failed? I found my voice, though it trembled slightly, though the words came haltingly at first before finding their rhythm. I told him about my father, about the gift he had passed to me, about the connection I had felt with Obsidian from the first moment I saw him as a gangly foal in the paddock. I told him that the horse was not broken, had never been broken, that he had simply been wounded in ways that required patience and love to heal rather than the cold assessment of experts who saw only damage and not potential. I told him that I did not expect to win, did not dream of prizes or glory, but that Obsidian deserved a chance to run, to prove himself, to show the world what he was capable of despite everything that had been done to him, and despite everything that had been said about him. The Duke turned from the window and looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time since I had entered his service, perhaps for the first time in his life. His eyes searched my face as if he were trying to solve a puzzle, to understand something that defied his usual categories of analysis and judgment. He said I was either very brave or very foolish. I told him perhaps I was both. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the marble facade, a glimpse of vulnerability beneath the aristocratic armor. For just a moment, I saw not the Duke of Ashford, but simply a man, wounded and uncertain, searching for something he thought he had lost forever. He looked almost human, almost approachable, almost like someone I might have known in another life, in another world, where birth and station did not separate people into immutable categories. He told me he would not stop me. The horse was mine, legally purchased, and he had no claim on it regardless of his feelings about the matter. But he warned me that the racing world would not be kind. They would see a servant woman as an affront to their exclusive domain, an insult to the natural order they believed in with religious fervor. They would do everything in their power to ensure I failed, to punish me for my presumption, to make an example of me for any other commoner who might dream of challenging their supremacy. I thanked him for the warning and told him I had expected nothing less. He nodded once, curtly, and moved toward the door. But as he passed me, close enough that I could smell the sandalwood of his cologne and see the faint lines of weariness around his eyes, he paused for the briefest moment. His hand lifted as if he meant to touch my arm, as if some instinct urged him toward connection, and then dropped back to his side, self-control reasserting itself over impulse. The door closed behind him, and I was left alone with the pounding of my heart and the certain knowledge that everything had changed, that the world I had known was tilting toward something new and uncertain and terrifying in its possibilities. The weeks leading up to the Royal Cup were a whirlwind of preparation and anxiety, of hope and fear intertwined so tightly that I could not always tell them apart. Mr. Hartley secured our entry, paying the fee from funds that had mysteriously appeared in an envelope on his doorstep one morning, an envelope that bore no return address and no indication of its sender. I never asked where the money came from, and he never offered to explain, but the look that passed between us suggested we both had our suspicions about whose hand had provided for us. Thomas trained with Obsidian every day, learning the horse's rhythms and preferences, his peculiarities and strengths, building the partnership that would be essential when they faced the finest thoroughbreds in England. I watched from the fence, offering suggestions based on years of observation, feeling the bond between horse and jockey strengthen with each passing session. They were ready as they would ever be, two outcasts united in their determination to prove the world wrong. The news of our entry spread through society like wildfire, consuming everything in its path, becoming the scandal of the season within days of the announcement. A housemaid competing in the Royal Cup. It was unprecedented, outrageous, delicious fodder for gossip and speculation in every drawing room and gentlemen's club in England. The newspapers printed mocking articles about the servant girl who fancied herself a racing magnate, accompanied by cruel caricatures that depicted me in my housemaid's uniform, mop in one hand and horse lead in the other, attempting to cross a finish line that receded mockingly before me. Betting houses refused to take wagers on Obsidian at any odds, declaring him a joke, a publicity stunt, not worthy of serious consideration by serious sporting men. I bore it all with what dignity I could muster, focusing on the work rather than the whispers. But it hurt. I will not pretend otherwise. To be mocked for daring to dream, to be dismissed without being given a chance to prove myself, to be reduced to a punchline in the drawing rooms of the wealthy while the servants snickered behind their hands. These were wounds that cut deeper than any physical injury, deeper than the exhaustion that dogged my every step, deeper even than the fear that sometimes overwhelmed me in the quiet hours of the night when I lay awake wondering what I had done and what I had yet to face. What kept me going was Obsidian. He did not care about my social standing or the opinions of newspaper editors, or the betting odds that proclaimed his chances non-existent. He greeted me each morning with the same eager nicker, pressed his nose against my palm with the same gentle trust, ran with the same breathtaking joy that had first convinced me he could be healed. When I was with him, the noise of the world faded away, became insignificant, became the distant buzzing of insects too small to notice. There was only the rhythm of his hooves, the warmth of his breath, the unspoken understanding that passed between us like a secret language only we could speak. He believed in me, even when I struggled to believe in myself, and his belief was enough to carry me forward. The Duke came to watch us train one afternoon, appearing unannounced at the edge of the field where Thomas was putting Obsidian through his paces. I noticed him immediately, his tall figure distinctive against the backdrop of green meadows and gray sky, motionless as a statue, watching with an intensity that I could feel even across the distance between us. He did not approach or speak, did not acknowledge my presence when I glanced in his direction, simply stood and observed, his expression unreadable, his thoughts hidden behind the mask he wore. When the session ended and Thomas led Obsidian back to the barn, I walked toward where the Duke stood, drawn by an impulse I did not fully understand, feeling as though we had unfinished business that demanded attention. I asked if he had come to assess the competition. He almost smiled. Almost. The corners of his mouth twitched, and something flickered in his gray eyes that might have been amusement, or might have been something deeper, something I did not dare to name. He said he had come to see if the rumors were true, if the broken horse he had discarded for a single pound had truly risen from the dead like some miracle of the sporting world. I told him to judge for himself. He was silent for a long moment, watching Obsidian's retreating form, the play of muscles beneath the black coat, the confidence of the stride that showed no trace of the injury that had been his death sentence. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, stripped of its usual formality, carrying an undertone of something that sounded almost like confession. He said he had made a mistake, not just in selling the horse, but in giving up on him. He had looked at Obsidian's injury and seen only an obstacle, a problem to be eliminated rather than solved. He had not considered that with time and care and faith, the obstacle might be overcome. He had applied to the horse the same approach he applied to everything in his life, the ruthless efficiency that allowed no room for hope or patience or the possibility of redemption. I did not know how to respond. The Duke of Ashford did not apologize, did not admit to mistakes, did not stand in muddy fields confessing his failures to housemaids. Yet here he was, doing exactly that. His aristocratic armor cracked just enough to reveal the uncertain man beneath. The man who had loved a wife who died too young and had spent the years since building walls to protect himself from ever feeling that pain again. I told him that we all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after we recognize them. He looked at me then, his gaze direct and searching, as though my words held meaning beyond their surface, as though I had offered him something precious without realizing what I was giving. He asked if I truly believed that, if I believed in redemption, in second chances, in the possibility of becoming something better than we have been. I told him I had to believe it. Otherwise, what was the point of trying? He nodded slowly, as if my answer had confirmed something he had long suspected, had wanted to believe but had not dared to without external validation. Then he wished me luck in the race and walked away, his tall figure disappearing into the gathering dusk, like a ghost returning to its haunting. I watched him go, my heart stirring with emotions I was not yet ready to name, understanding only that something had shifted between us, that the walls we had both built were not as solid as we had believed. The day of the Royal Cup dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect summer morning that seemed designed by Providence to witness great events. The sky was a dome of cloudless blue, the air fresh and sweet with the scent of grass and wildflowers, the sunlight falling golden across the countryside, as if heaven itself was smiling on the proceedings below. I had barely slept the night before, too nervous to close my eyes for more than minutes at a time, too aware of everything that could go wrong, too overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was about to attempt. Every time I began to drift off, my mind would conjure new disasters, new humiliations, new ways in which the day could end in failure and shame. By the time the first light crept through my window, I was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, drained by anxiety and anticipation, and the terrible weight of dreams about to be tested against reality. Thomas arrived at the farm before sunrise, his young face pale but determined, his eyes holding a steadiness that calmed my own jangling nerves. He had been through this before, had faced crowds and competition and the pressure of expectation, and his confidence was infectious, a reminder that we were not completely unprepared for what awaited us. Mr. Hartley came shortly after, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth that he presented to me with a gruff ceremony that could not quite hide his emotion. I unwrapped it carefully, my breath catching when I saw what lay within. Racing silks, crimson and silver, the colors of Ashford Hall, the colors Obsidian had worn during his championship season before the accident that had ended everything. I stared at the silks, unable to speak, understanding what they represented and what it meant that Mr. Hartley had obtained them. They were the Duke's colors, the livery that identified horses as belonging to one of the most prestigious racing establishments in England. To wear them now, as a servant competing against the very aristocracy they represented, was either a brilliant stroke of symbolism or an act of unforgivable presumption. Perhaps both. Mr. Hartley shrugged when I questioned him, his weathered face creased with something that might have been mischief. He said the horse had earned those colors, had proven himself worthy of them before the accident and would prove himself again today. It seemed only right that he should wear them one more time, should carry into battle the standard he had once championed. I did not ask who had authorized the use of the colors, whose permission had been granted or assumed. Some questions are better left unasked, their answers implied rather than stated. The journey to the racecourse took 3 hours, Obsidian traveling in a borrowed horse cart while I sat beside the driver, my stomach churning with anxiety that no amount of deep breathing could calm. The crowds grew thicker as we approached, carriages and pedestrians clogging the roads, the festive atmosphere at odds with my mounting dread. Vendors hawked refreshments and souvenir programs. Musicians played in the fields adjacent to the course. Families spread blankets on the grass to enjoy the spectacle. It was a celebration, a holiday, and I was about to become its centerpiece in ways I was not certain I wanted. By the time we reached the stable area, reserved for the competing horses, I was trembling so badly I could barely climb down from the cart. My legs felt weak, my hands unsteady, my heart racing faster than any horse ever could. I forced myself to breathe, to focus on the task at hand, to remember why I was here and what I had already overcome to reach this moment. The other owners and trainers watched us arrive with undisguised contempt, their expressions ranging from amused disdain to outright hostility. They whispered behind their hands, pointed, laughed, making no effort to hide their scorn for the upstart who had dared to invade their exclusive territory. I heard snatches of their conversations, insults thinly veiled as observations, predictions of humiliation and failure. The servant girl and her crippled horse, the joke of the season. Did she really think she could compete against true thoroughbreds? Against horses bred in the finest stables in England, trained by the most accomplished professionals, ridden by jockeys who had spent their entire lives preparing for moments like this? I ignored them as best I could, focusing on Obsidian, on ensuring he was comfortable after the journey, on calming my own nerves enough to calm his. He was agitated, picking up on my anxiety as horses always do, his ears swiveling and his hooves stamping against the straw-covered floor of his temporary stall. I stood at his head and spoke to him softly, using the same words I had used during his long recovery, the same tone my father had taught me for soothing frightened animals. Slowly, gradually he settled. His breathing evened, his muscles relaxed, his dark eyes found mine and held them. I felt the connection between us, that mysterious bond that transcended words and logic, and the fear that had gripped me began to loosen its hold. Whatever happened today, we would face it together. We had faced worse and survived. We had been broken and had healed. This was just another challenge, just another obstacle to overcome, and we had proven ourselves capable of overcoming the impossible. The race was scheduled for 3 o'clock, the culmination of a day of festivities and preliminary events that I barely noticed, too focused on my own preparations to pay attention to anything else. As the hour approached, I helped Thomas into the saddle and led Obsidian toward the starting area, my hand steady on his bridle, my voice calm and reassuring. The other horses were already assembling, magnificent creatures with glossy coats and powerful builds, each one representing the best that money and breeding and generations of expertise could produce. They were beautiful. I could not deny it. Every one of them a masterpiece of equine design, every one of them a potential champion. Obsidian looked small among them, still thin from his long recovery, his black coat lacking the mirror shine of horses that had been pampered and groomed by armies of servants. But then he lifted his head, and I saw the fire in his eyes, the warrior spirit that had never truly been extinguished despite everything he had endured. He might look like the underdog, might appear to be outclassed by the magnificent creatures surrounding him, but he knew who he was. He knew what he was capable of. And in that moment, watching him survey his competition with an arrogance that bordered on contempt, I knew it too. The Duke was there, I realized. I spotted him in the stands reserved for the nobility, his dark coat and silver-streaked hair distinctive even at a distance. He was watching, his expression unreadable, his presence a weight I felt even across the crowded racecourse. Our eyes met for just a moment, a connection that transcended the chaos and noise between us, and then I turned away, focusing on the task at hand. Thomas leaned down from the saddle, his young face set with determination, his hands steady on the reins. He asked if I had any final instructions. I told him to trust the horse. Obsidian knew what to do. He had been born for this moment, had survived against impossible odds to reach this moment. All Thomas had to do was hold on and believe. The starting bell rang, a sharp clang that cut through the noise of the crowd like a blade through silk, and the horses exploded forward in a thunder of hooves. I gripped the fence so hard my knuckles turned white, my eyes fixed on the crimson and silver silks as they merged into the pack of competitors, becoming one small fragment of a larger chaos of color and motion. For the first few furlongs, I could not distinguish Obsidian from the others, could only watch the mass of horses surging around the track, their jockeys bent low over their necks, their hooves churning the dirt into clouds of dust. My heart was in my throat, my breath coming in short gasps, every muscle in my body tensed with desperate hope and desperate fear. Then, as they rounded the first turn, he emerged from the pack. He was running fifth, then fourth, then third, his black form weaving between the other horses with a fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural. Thomas was riding beautifully, keeping him steady, conserving his energy for the final push, their partnership evident in every synchronized movement. They hit the backstretch and Obsidian accelerated, his stride lengthening, his body becoming a blur of speed and power, his hooves barely seeming to touch the ground as he devoured the distance. The crowd had noticed him now. The laughter and mockery had given way to gasps of surprise, then exclamations of disbelief, then something that sounded almost like excitement. The crippled horse, the servant's folly, was running like a champion, was passing horses that had been bred for generations to be unbeatable, was making a mockery of every prediction that had been made about him. He passed the second-place horse as if it were standing still, its rider whipping furiously, futilely, unable to close the gap that was opening with every stride. By the time they entered the final turn, Obsidian was just 2 lengths behind the leader, a magnificent chestnut belonging to an earl whose horses had won the Royal Cup 3 times in the past decade. I was screaming, I realized. Screaming his name, screaming encouragement, my voice lost in the roar of the crowd, but carrying all my hope, all my faith, all my love for the creature who had taught me that broken things could heal. Beside me, Mr. Hartley was weeping openly, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, making no effort to hide his emotion. On the track, Obsidian and the chestnut raced side by side, neither willing to give ground, both straining toward the finish line with every ounce of strength they possessed. The final furlong seemed to last an eternity, time stretching and warping until each second contained 1,000 heartbeats. The crowd was on its feet, their cheers deafening, their attention fixed on the 2 horses battling for supremacy. Obsidian's neck was extended, his nostrils flared, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the finish line that only he could see. He was running not for the prize or the glory, but for the sheer joy of movement, the primal ecstasy of doing what he had been born to do. He crossed the finish line ahead in front of the chestnut. The crowd erupted in a sound that was unlike anything I had ever heard, a wall of noise that seemed to shake the very earth. I fell to my knees, my legs no longer able to support me, my body overwhelmed by an emotion too large to contain. We had won. Against every prediction, every expectation, every law of probability, we had won. Obsidian, the horse they said would never walk again, had just taken the Royal Cup. The rest of the day passed in a blur of chaos and celebration that I remember only in fragments. Thomas was lifted onto the shoulders of cheering spectators, carried around the winner's circle like a conquering hero. Mr. Hartley was surrounded by reporters demanding to know how he had achieved the impossible, how a servant and a discarded horse had defeated the finest racing establishment in England. And I, the housemaid who had dared to dream, found myself thrust into a spotlight I had never sought and did not know how to navigate. The prize money was real, £1,000,000, a fortune beyond anything I had imagined, beyond anything I had allowed myself to hope for. They presented me with a bank draft, a piece of paper that represented more wealth than my family had accumulated over generations of service, more than enough to transform every aspect of my existence. I held it in my trembling hands and stared at the figures written there, unable to quite believe they were real, unable to connect this moment to the person I had been just months ago, changing linens and polishing silver in a great house that would never be mine. But more valuable than the money was the vindication, the proof that worth was not determined by birth or station, that faith and love and stubborn determination could triumph over the judgment of the mighty. I had proven something not just to the racing world, but to myself, had demonstrated that the limitations I had always accepted as immutable were nothing more than beliefs waiting to be challenged. It was evening before I found a moment of quiet, slipping away from the celebrations to stand alone at Obsidian's stall. The noise of the festivities was muted here, reduced to a distant murmur, and I savored the peace, the chance to be alone with my thoughts and with the creature who had made everything possible. He was tired but content, munching on the extra rations of oats I had insisted he deserved, his dark eyes drowsy with satisfaction. When I entered, he raised his head and nickered softly, that familiar sound that had greeted me through so many months of struggle, so many mornings of hope and evenings of exhaustion. I pressed my forehead against his, closed my eyes, felt the warmth of his skin and the rhythm of his breathing. I told him we did it. I told him I was proud of him, more proud than I had ever been of anything in my life. I told him I loved him with a fierceness that surprised me, loved him not for what he had won today, but for what he had taught me about the resilience of the spirit and the power of refusing to give up. A voice behind me said those were words he had hoped to hear, though perhaps not directed at a horse. I turned to find the Duke standing in the doorway of the stall, his tall form silhouetted against the lamplight that flickered in the stable corridor. He had removed his coat, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up, an informality I had never seen from him before, a departure from the rigid propriety that had always defined his public appearance. His gray eyes were soft, almost gentle, lacking the cold distance that had characterized every interaction we had ever had. He stepped into the stall, his movements careful, respectful of the horse and the intimacy of the space. He stopped a few feet away from me, close enough that I could see the details of his face in the lamplight, the lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, the vulnerability he was finally allowing himself to reveal. He said he had come to offer his congratulations, but that seemed insufficient now. What I had accomplished today was more than a racing victory. It was a rebuke to everything he had believed, a demonstration that he had been wrong about more than just a horse. I told him he was too hard on himself. He shook his head. He said I did not understand, could not understand because I had not lived his life, had not made his choices, had not built the walls he had built. When he sold Obsidian, he had been trying to erase a failure, to remove a reminder of his own limitations, to deny the pain of lost potential by pretending it had never existed. He had done the same thing after his wife died, sealing off parts of himself, discarding anything that caused pain rather than facing it and finding a way to heal. I had shown him another path. I had shown him that broken things could be mended, that patience and love could work miracles, that giving up was a choice, not an inevitability. The distance between us seemed to shrink, though neither of us had moved. I could feel his presence like a warmth against my skin, could sense the emotion radiating from him like heat from a fire too long banked. He was not the cold, untouchable Duke I had observed from afar for so many years. He was simply a man, wounded and uncertain, searching for something he had thought forever lost. He asked if I would consider staying at Ashford Hall. Not as a servant, he hastened to add, but as something else. He was not sure what to call it. What title could possibly capture what he was proposing? A partner, perhaps. Someone who could help him rebuild what he had allowed to crumble. I told him that was a very improper suggestion for a duke to make to a housemaid. He said he was learning that propriety was overrated. I laughed, surprising myself with the sound, and the tension that had been building between us broke like a wave against the shore. He smiled in response, a real smile that transformed his face, that made him look years younger, that revealed the man he might have been if life had treated him more gently, if loss had not taught him to fear connection. I did not give him an answer that night. There was too much to process, too many implications to consider, too many questions that needed to be asked and answered before I could commit to anything beyond this moment. But when he offered me his hand to help me step over the stall door, I took it without hesitation. His fingers were warm and strong around mine, and he held on just a moment longer than necessary, as if reluctant to release me, as if the contact between us was something precious that should not be surrendered lightly. Outside, the stars were emerging one by one, pinpricks of light against the velvet darkness. The noise of the celebration had faded to a distant memory. The world felt new and full of possibilities I had never dared to imagine. The weeks following the Royal Cup were unlike anything I had experienced, a transformation so complete that I sometimes felt I was living someone else's life. The £1,000,000 prize changed my circumstances overnight. I was no longer a servant dependent on the goodwill of employers, no longer bound by the narrow horizons that had defined my existence since birth. I was a woman of means, a celebrated figure in the racing world, someone whose opinion was sought and whose presence was requested at events I once would have attended only to serve refreshments. I resigned my position at Ashford Hall, not because I was forced to, but because it seemed absurd to continue polishing silver when I could now afford to buy the entire estate if I wished. Mrs. Pemberton accepted my notice with a grace that surprised me, telling me she had always known I was destined for something more than service, that she had seen it in me from the first day I arrived as a grieving girl with nowhere else to go. Her words stayed with me long after I left, a reminder that even in the strictest hierarchies, there were people who saw others as individuals rather than functions. Aunt Prudence was bemused by my sudden fortune, treating my transformation with the same practical skepticism she applied to everything else in life. She suggested I purchase proper stables for Obsidian, invest the remainder wisely with someone who understood money better than either of us, and ignore the society gossips who would inevitably question how a servant had risen so high. Her advice was sound, as her advice always was, and I followed it, finding in the practical details of wealth management a welcome distraction from the more complicated questions that occupied my thoughts. The Duke continued to court me, though courting is perhaps too gentle a word for the stubborn campaign he waged against my hesitation. He visited my new property nearly every day, finding excuses that grew increasingly transparent as the weeks passed. He needed advice on a horse he was considering purchasing and valued my expertise. He wanted to discuss a change to the training regimen at his stables and thought I might have insights to offer. He had heard of a new veterinary treatment being developed in France and wondered if I might find it interesting for Obsidian's ongoing care. Each visit lasted longer than the previous one, and each ended with him lingering at the door, his gray eyes conveying things his words did not yet say. I made him wait, not out of cruelty or calculation, but because I needed to be certain that what was growing between us was real, not simply the infatuation of a man dazzled by novelty, not the passing fancy of an aristocrat who would tire of his servant bride once the scandal had faded. The chasm between our social positions had not disappeared simply because I had won a horse race. The world would judge our union harshly. His peers would whisper that he had lost his mind, that the grief of his wife's death had finally unbalanced him, that he was throwing away his family's honor for a woman who had scrubbed his floors. My former colleagues would wonder what schemes I had employed to trap a duke, what feminine wiles I had used to secure a position I had no right to claim. Any relationship we built would have to be strong enough to withstand that scrutiny, strong enough to survive the weight of judgment that would press upon it from all sides. Summer gave way to autumn, the green of the meadows fading to gold and rust, the days shortening, the air growing crisp with the promise of winter. Obsidian settled into the new stables I had built for him. Content and healthy, his championship season behind him. I began to consider what the future might hold, what I wanted beyond the immediate triumph I had achieved. Money, I discovered, did not automatically bring purpose. It simply removed the obstacles that had previously prevented me from pursuing one. The Duke proposed on a frost-covered morning in late December, the anniversary of the day I had purchased Obsidian for £1. He appeared at my door as the sun was rising, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled as though he had dressed in haste. In his hands, he held not a ring, but a simple leather halter. worn and weathered, instantly recognizable as the one I had used to lead Obsidian home on the day everything changed. He said he had acquired it from Mr. Hartley, who had kept it all these months without knowing why, preserving it as though sensing it would one day have significance. He said it seemed fitting that the symbol of my beginning should also mark our beginning together. He said he loved me, had loved me since the day he walked into that blue guest room, and found himself facing a woman who refused to be intimidated by his title or his wealth, who treated him like a man rather than a position. He said he wanted to spend the rest of his life with me, learning from me, becoming the man I seemed to believe he could be. I took the halter from his hands and ran my fingers over the worn leather, remembering. I remembered the terror and hope of that first morning, the long walk through the cold, the months of struggle and uncertainty that had followed. I remembered the moment I decided to take a chance on a broken horse, the moment I decided to take a chance on myself. I told him yes. We married in the spring, when the gardens of Ashford Hall were bursting with new life, and the air was sweet with the scent of blossoms. It was not a grand wedding by aristocratic standards, not the society spectacle that some had anticipated. Sebastian wanted only a small gathering of people who genuinely cared for us, and I could not disagree. Mr. Hartley served as witness. His weathered face creased with emotion he tried unsuccessfully to hide. Thomas Gray and his wife attended, along with Aunt Prudence, who wore her best dress and pretended not to cry when I walked down the aisle. The servants of Ashford Hall, my former colleagues, were invited as guests rather than staff, a gesture that scandalized society but felt absolutely right. I wore a gown of ivory silk, simple but elegant, with a train that swept behind me as I walked. In my hair, tucked among the flowers, was a small crimson ribbon, the same shade as the racing silks Obsidian had worn to victory. Sebastian stood waiting at the altar of the chapel, his gray eyes bright with emotion, his usual reserve abandoned. When I reached him and took his hand, he whispered that I was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. I told him he was biased. He said he was, and proud of it. Marriage did not transform us into different people, but it did allow us to become more fully ourselves. Sebastian softened, learning to express the feelings he had kept locked away for so long, allowing himself to laugh and to grieve and to be vulnerable in ways he had never permitted since his first wife's death. I grew more confident, no longer second-guessing my right to occupy the spaces I now inhabited, finding my voice in drawing rooms and boardrooms where once I would have been invisible. We argued sometimes, as all couples do, but our arguments were honest, free of the resentments that poison so many unions. We respected each other too much for cruelty, loved each other too deeply for indifference. Ashford Hall became a different place under our shared stewardship. Sebastian reduced his business holdings, delegating the management of his commercial empire to trusted associates, freeing himself to focus on the things that truly mattered. The racing stables flourished, not as a money-making enterprise, but as a labor of love. We rescued horses that others had discarded, gave them second chances, proved again and again that worth was not determined by appearance or circumstance. Obsidian, retired from racing but still magnificent, became the heart of our operation, the living symbol of everything we believed. He lived to the remarkable age of 32, longer than any thoroughbred in the history of Ashford Hall, and when he finally passed, peacefully in his sleep on a quiet spring morning, we buried him in the meadow where he had first run free after his recovery, beneath an oak tree that had stood for centuries. His grave is marked with a simple stone that bears his name and a single inscription. He taught us that broken things can heal. Years passed, more than I can easily count now, full of joy and sorrow and all the ordinary miracles that make up a life well lived. Sebastian was taken from me 3 years ago, peacefully in his sleep after a long and happy life, and I miss him every day with an ache that time has not diminished. But I do not grieve as I might have once. Death is not an ending, not truly. It is simply a transition, a passage from one state of being to another. He is with me still, in my memories, in the life we built together, in the legacy we leave behind. Sometimes in the quiet hours of evening, I walk to the meadow where obsidian is buried and stand beneath the oak tree, remembering. I remember a young woman with nothing but a pound and a stubborn heart. I remember a black horse with wounded eyes and a spirit that refused to be broken. I remember the day everything changed, and all the days that followed, and I feel such gratitude for the life I have lived that I can scarcely contain it. They said he was broken beyond repair, that poor discarded horse the great Duke sold for a single pound. They said I was foolish to believe otherwise, a servant girl with ideas above her station. But I knew something they did not. I knew that the measure of a soul, whether human or horse, is not in its perfection, but in its resilience. I knew that love, patient and persistent, can work miracles that defy all reason. I knew that the only true failure is the failure to try. Obsidian taught me that. Sebastian taught me that. Life itself taught me that, with its endless capacity for surprise and redemption. And now, as the sun sets over Ashford Hall and the stars begin to emerge one by one, I sit by my window and set down these words, hoping that someone, somewhere, will read them and find courage. Hoping that some other woman with an impossible dream will remember that dreams are never truly impossible if you are willing to fight for them. Hoping that some other broken creature, human or otherwise, will learn that healing is always possible, that second chances are real, that the story is never over until we decide to stop writing it. This is my story. The story of Eleanor Whitmore. Once a housemaid, now a duchess, forever a believer in the miraculous, ordinary power of stubborn, foolish, undefeatable love. It began with a single pound and a single act of faith. It led me to places I never imagined, taught me truths I never expected, filled my life with more joy and meaning than I had any right to hope for. And now, as my own evening approaches, I find myself at peace. The race has been run. The finish line has been crossed. Whatever comes next, I will face it as I have faced everything else, with courage and hope and the unshakable conviction that love, in the end, always wins. Always.